have concerns about your personal information being exposed online? Information such as your home address, date of birth, voting preferences, and more readily available with one search. DataSeal is the comprehensive data removal service I trust. I use it. So use the link below to receive 5% off of your DataSeal subscription and protect your family. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking to Bill about the West Memphis 3 case. Very intriguing case, one of those cases that are right up there is ones that I would like to know the outcome of it. I'm asked that all the time. Which case would you want to know the outcome of to solve if you had to solve them all? West Memphis 3 is right up there because of the brutality of these young boys. It's just a very intriguing case. Now, some people, they just wash their hands with it right away and say, hey, there was an arrest in the case, and those 3 boys that they arrested are guilty. And that being Damian Eccles, Jesse Miss Kelly, and Jason Baldwin. I won't jump on that right away. There were some, not mistakes, I'm going to say made. Yeah, I guess they're mistakes. The overall picture is a big mistake. You can't convict anybody when they have no physical evidence, but it happens all the time, right? I just don't like it. So we're going to talk to Bill about things, see what he says, because he's familiar with the case. He's followed it, he's studied it, and I'm curious. I'm always curious to get other people's view, right? Let's see what other people say, what other people think, what other people, their opinions are. Because there might be something in there that, you know, you can learn from. And that's what it's all about. Everything's a teachable moment, and you can learn from. Some things that you hear people say, you can just throw out the window. But there might be one thing in there that you can grasp a hold of and say, oh, I didn't think of that. So let's look out and see if there's anything that Bill can shed some light on for me and for you guys. Okay, we're back with Bill Noguera, live from San Quentin Death Row Prison. We're going to talk today about West Memphis 3, and we're going to jump right into it. Bill, you're familiar with this case?
I am, yes.
All right, tell me how you came about getting familiarized with this. This happened in what, I believe, May of 1993?
It did, and, you know, I caught the case when it did happen. There was a lot of news coverage on it, but what really piqued my interest was, and I hate to admit this, but at one point I went by the Oprah Winfrey show, and they had Damian Eccles there, and he began speaking about his ordeal. He had written a book about it. I became interested, not only just because of who he was, but I wanted to figure out who actually did this. Was it these guys, 3 kids, Damian Eccles, Jesse McKelly, and their other friend, Jason Baldwin, or was it a different perpetrator? So I read the book, studied the case, and I came with my own conclusions of what they did right, what they did wrong, and really that's how I came to really know the case.
What do you remember what book it was that you read? Because there's been a couple of them out.
Yeah, I believe it was written by Damian Eccles, and I don't remember the title of the book right now, but it was specifically written by him. I think it was him and his wife at the time who had come together to write this book about his ordeal and what he went through, which was basically 18 years in prison for a crime that he continues to say I had nothing to do with it. Okay.
So you're leaving us hanging already. I like that because you didn't say because he's innocent or because he's guilty. So I like that intro. So go ahead and tell me, I mean, we know about the background of the case. I'm assuming everybody knows the 3 kids. I think Stevie Branch, Chris Byers, and Michael Moore. How old were they? Are they 8 years old? Something like that?
They were 8. Yes, they were 8 years old, second graders. All 3 were found basically in the same location. They were naked. They were hog-tied. One of them had several lacerations, was mutilated sexually, which means that the genitalia was mutilated, and the other kids seemed to have been stabbed as well as then drowned. So a horrible situation, horrible scene happened on, I think they found the bodies on May the 6th, which was a day or two after the actual crime happened. And from the get-go, they really, look, I'm not one of those guys who likes to jump on the bandwagon against what law enforcement does.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
We're talking about 1993, where like West Memphis. It's the Bible Belt, and look, people focus on things really quickly, and they made a lot of mistakes. They didn't know what they were doing in this investigation, and I believe. I hate to say the guy's innocent or guy's guilty because that's not really what I want to do here. I'd like to give reasons why I believe he may be innocent and reasons why I believe he may be guilty, or all three of them were guilty, because everybody really focused on Damien Eccles as being the perpetrator, although the other three guys are there. Jesse, Miss Kelly, he was the one that really gave up the hoo-ha about saying, look, this is what happened, we were involved. But people are really focused on Damien, and he's the one that got the death sentence behind this. So even prosecution believes that he was the main character. He was older than the other boys. He was the perfect candidate for this case.
Yeah, so I want to, for the people that don't know, the place where these boys were found is like a wooded area. It had a small creek or drainage ditch that had a good amount of water in it. And the boys were found, and their bikes, I believe, were found in that ditch, in the water, hidden. Their clothing, which had been stripped off of them, had been taken with sticks and held to the bottom under the water so they wouldn't float up. I think all their clothing, except for, I want to say maybe their socks or their underwear, went missing. Now, I don't know whether they were taken or they just floated somewhere where they were never found. That I'm not sure, but I just wanted to give the audience a sense of the location. It kind of wooded, but it's right off of a major interstate, and there was a truck stop, I believe, within sight of where their bodies and eventually their bikes were found. Does that sound right to you?
That's absolutely correct. And the items that were missing were two of the boys' underwear. I believe that's significant. Look, if it was one sock and a T-shirt or a pair of one underwear and a sock, I'd get it. But it's too much. I don't believe in coincidences. I just don't. And I have that type of mind when it comes to coincidences. They just don't jive with me. And that both of the boys' underwear were missing tends to really make me lean towards someone who possibly knew the kids, as well as a person who had a sexual type of, he leaned towards a sexuality. And because one of the children's sexual organs were mutilated, that also gives me pause.
Okay, well, speaking of the mutilation of one of the boys' penises, I believe, or at least one of the boys, it has also been inferred that was due to turtle activity in that ditch. Have you heard that?
Yeah, I did read on a number of occasions that, well, basically the defense said that the prosecution said that these boys. Sorry about that.
Okay.
The prosecution's position was it was a knife attack, and the perpetrator mutilated the sexual organs of Christopher, I believe, and that's really how it happened. The defense on the other side said, look, this is a drainage ditch, there are turtles there, there are other wildlife there, the mutilation could have happened because of animals. I don't believe that. This is not to say that I believe these three were guilty. I don't believe that animals did that. And the reasoning is pretty simple. First of all, the defense said that to lessen the horrific nature of the crime. The defense's job is to show, look, that didn't happen this way. That was animals. If my client is guilty, then he only just stabbed these kids. Like, I know I say only, but only because it's what they put forward. And it's a defense strategy. I believe that the person that did this mutilated the children's, the one child's genitalia. I also believe
this call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
That this had nothing to do with satanic rituals or none of that stuff that was put out there. And unfortunately for the victims' families, the three kids involved, that's something that law enforcement leaked. And And that was a huge problem for me. I read multiple reports by even prosecutions, people that wrote about this case that said that that was an act of unprofessional conduct on law enforcement, and they should never have done that.
Well, I want to talk about the boys themselves being found the way they were, okay? They're stripped naked and they're hogtied. So let's go one at a time. Let's talk about them being naked. If we just think back to the yogurt shop murders that we just did, with those girls being tied up the way that they were and executed. And tell me if I'm wrong here, or add to it. Right off the cuff, there's 3 reasons why you strip somebody naked. 1 is because it's sexual in nature. 2, you're controlling them. Or 3, you're embarrassing them for whatever reason. Now, I guess there could be some more reasons, and if there are, please add to them. But are those the 3 that we could focus on in this instance?
Yes, absolutely. I lean not for the whole control issue. He had them controlled. And he had them controlled because he was stronger, he was taller, he was bigger, and he hogtied them. That was part of the control. The clothing, I believe, was sexual in nature. This was a person, and I'm leaning towards persons, as you've noticed. I didn't say persons, plural. I said person. This person did this because his whole deal was sexual in nature. Those boys, as I mentioned, were stripped. They were in water. It's very difficult to then find DNA at that particular point if they've been submerged in water or in water or out in the elements for that much time, which was about a day. So you're correct in what you said, but I believe this whole thing was sexual in nature.
Okay, well, you're going to lead me into my thoughts that I believe that it is more than one person. And the reason I say that is because of the knots on the boys' hog-tied shoelaces. There was 3 different knots. Now, I understand that, one person can tie 3 different knots. Yet, I think it is more probable than not that one person, while tying 3 people, will tie the same knot each time. You agree or disagree with that?
I agree. And that's, like I said before when I first started, that will give you reasons why I believe these guys were guilty and why they are not guilty.
Okay.
That's a big marker that flies up with me is that, yeah, you're right. All boys, each one of the boys was tied with a different knot.
Yeah, that's big for me as well. That's one of the things that I have written down here in front of me is what points me to Damien, Jesse, and Jason. Just one thing. But some other things that point me away from them is there is absolutely 0 evidence that I saw that points to those 3. I mean, physical evidence.
That's a huge problem for me. Yeah, no, I know I can't see you, but I know you're laughing because it's not funny. But if both you and I are at that crime scene, we're looking at this thing. We're looking, and look, this. Correct me if I'm wrong. You're a former detective, and I'm sure you've done a number of cases like this. So
you have 60 seconds remaining.
The point being in all this is usually investigators they have a crime scene, and then they analyze the crime scene, and then they look for suspects. Here, they had a suspect first, and then matched the crime to him. I thought it was a huge mistake. Am I wrong, or am I right? And please, I'll call, and you can let us know.
Yeah, I think you're right on that, but give me a call back, and we'll discuss further.
Okay.
Okay, so go ahead with your thoughts on the lack of evidence.
Yeah, so to do that, I mentioned that this crime, it just, I believe from the very beginning, law enforcement made huge mistakes. And they were so pressured. These are 3 kids. This is the Bible Belt. This is Memphis. This isn't a place like a metropolitan area like San Francisco, Los Angeles, and New York, where this stuff happens all the time. And this shocked people. So law enforcement right away, they had a crime, and soon they had a suspect who they believed was involved. And they basically matched the crime to him rather than them look for a suspect based on the crime, the motive. Basically, the crime had to match the person's MO or his form of operation or what he'd done in the past. They did nothing like that. They focused on these kids because of just rumors. You had a woman named Vicki Hutchinson, and just around the time of the murders, she's brought in for questioning because she supposedly stole some money from one of her employers. During this problem, there's a ruckus. Her son's there. He's running around. He happens to be a child that knows the three boys who were murdered. And during a conversation, her lie detector test says, because she took one, that she was deceiving them about something. They're about to charge her for theft when all of a sudden her son Aaron comes up with a story that he knows about these murders. And the story began to evolve, stating that he actually was there. He saw the murders happen. And it was part of a satanic cult or person who spoke Spanish. That immediately got law enforcement to start really looking at this satanic stuff and all this occult stuff. And by the way, they leaked that to the press, and they leaked that part of the conversation to the press about what this kid was saying. Of course, everybody in that neighborhood or in that area knew that Eccles was kind of a cult guy. He dressed in black. He didn't match the community. He was different. All three of these kids that they asserted as being the perpetrators of this crime were kind of outsiders. They weren't the normal guy that went to school. They were dropouts. They listened to acid rock, to AC/DC, for God's sakes. So that got them interested in these guys. And of course, we have teenagers who talk. And this is where the investigation starts going towards Eccles, and ultimately you have one kid, the 17-year-old Jesse Miskelly, who, by the way, has an IQ of 72. Look, I'm not a politically correct guy, so I'm going to call it what it is. This guy was borderline retarded. And I know that's not the right word to use, but I don't have another word to say it. And they interviewed him for 12 hours. Ken, I don't know about you, but that's a long time for a 17-year-old boy who has no experience in crime, no experience with law enforcement, and he's being pressured for 12 hours. And then in that 12-hour period, 4 hours in, he comes up with this story. No attorneys are there. His parents are not there. And he starts talking about what he was involved in. And that's how this case goes full circle from not having a suspect to having the exact suspect they wanted.
Yeah, so, I mean, his interview, to me, they meaning law enforcement investigators, certainly fed him. It was completely wrong. I see where they were going with it and why they were doing it, yet it doesn't make it right. And that's my thought on the interview itself with Jesse. I mean, something as simple as when it occurred. And he has to say, 12 o'clock at noon or whatever, something that was completely wrong because the kids were in school. You can't get that wrong when you're a guilty party.
You're absolutely right. And that's where this whole problem comes in. This kid has a confession. Okay, so we have a confession. Let's say, okay, we're going to at least do our due diligence and investigate it. Here's the problem with that. He has a 72 IQ. He is in the 6th percentile of intelligence, which means that 94% of the population has a high IQ than this kid. Think about that for a minute. But his confession is inconsistent. That's where law enforcement said, okay, look, maybe we pressured this guy. He said they used rope to tie the kids. It was shoelaces. That's something you don't forget. He said that the kids kids were raped. There was no rape. He said it happened at night. He said that it happened during the daytime. It happened at night. Those are huge problems in a confession that doesn't match the crime.
Right.
And that's something that should have been huge markers. Okay, so what do police do then? So, of course, they get this woman, Vicky Hutchison, who, by the way, knows the $35,000 reward. She knows this. She then puts a mic in her house, or law enforcement mics her up, and gets this guy, Eccles, to come over her house and hopefully confess these crimes, which never happens. But, of course, she says that Eccles bragged about killing the kids.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And there you have it. That's how they start focusing on these kids. And then when Miss Kelly begins to confess these murders, that turns into a huge problem. And those are some of the things that you have that really implicate him in this crime, which is supposedly his crime partner confessing to it.
Well, and before I forget, just on a side note, is Jason Baldwin reminds me of me when I was his age. The way that he dressed, not Damien, but Jason, the way that he dressed, the music he listened to, his hair, and all that. Every time that I see him when I was researching this, it reminded me of me when I was his age. But I digress. One of the things that bugged me about Damien and Jason that they did that made them look guilty in my eyes, and it's just a small thing, but it's one of those things where I chalk up to, hey, you know, guilty people do this, is when the police showed up, they ran and hid under the bed or in the closet. And I'm not sure if you knew that or not. Now, that's not an indicator in itself, especially for teens, but it was one of those things that stuck out to me that I said, you know, innocent people don't do that.
And I agree, but they could have been guilty of something else. They could have stolen something. They could have done something that same day, and we don't know whether they did or not, but there's easy explanations why kids, especially teenagers, act certain ways. So I'd like to go into a little bit what makes them feel guilty or look guilty, and I'll go very quickly through this list, and you correct me if I'm wrong. So first is, of course, the confession by Miss Kelly. He has a lack of an alibi, low IQ, but he has a job and he's functional. So maybe the guy's going to lie. Jason Baldwin has no alibi whatsoever. Eccles is the big guy here. He spoke to the police department, and at some point in his supposed confession or talk, he begins to say that he understands why someone would do this, why someone would kill someone, and that the victims would be easy to control. He also has mental health issues. He believes that he's possessed by a demon. He's a sociopath. He's actually psychopathic in a way. And he says this with his own words because he wants to collect disability. Was he lying? Don't know. But these are his own words. Then he lies about being familiar with the Robin Hood area. We know that's a lie because he knows that area very well. He was also seen on or about the day this happened with mud all over his body. His alibi was not real. He also bragged about the killings to other people. A knife was found in a lake behind his home that matched the shape of the forehead or body of one of the children. And then there was this blue wax that was found on the victims that were found in his home that belonged to one of his girlfriends. So those are the reasons that you can really point and say, well, there's enough there at least to pique law enforcement interest to at least investigate these guys thoroughly.
Yes, and you hit it right on the head. There's enough to investigate these guys thoroughly because of that, but there is not enough reasons there to indict or to arrest or convict, in my opinion.
Correct, and that's where it points to the parts where I'm going to talk about why I believe they may be innocent. Look, I don't know. I wasn't there. Well, you nor I know what happened, but from experience, we can look at things and say, okay, that doesn't match. So here's what doesn't match and why they could be innocent. First and foremost, the nature of the crimes, and that's the big one for me. You have enough experience with this kind of stuff to know that the nature of the crime, those are not teenagers. There's a sexual component, and it's usually by a single killer, one that's involved in domination. Those kids were dominated. The control of being tied the way they were tied, hog-tied, that's a very specific control factor. Kids that are 16, 17 years old don't really think about hog-tying people. That's something that a person with more experience has to look at. That's what gets him off. That is what people say is a signature. That would be a signature. The hog-tying. You could have controlled him. You could tie his feet, tie their wrists, but he hog-tied them. That's important. Okay, so, and that is usually the makings of an organized killers. These kids, by no definition of the word, are organized. These kids are not even close to being organized. So, the expected profile would not be teenagers. The confessions, I believe they were coerced. As I mentioned before, the 12 hours, there's 4 hours in, he starts talking about it. But there's only 46 minutes of the recording in the entire 12 hours. Why? Well, it's simple. Law enforcement was pressuring. They were extorting a confession, but they were pushing on him, and they didn't want that recorded. When they wanted to hear what he wanted to say, and he was saying what they wanted to say, they pressed the record button.
Bill,
that's unlawful.
Let me interrupt there for a second, just because if I don't, I'm going to lose this train of thought.
Okay.
When you were arrested, you were 18, I believe, 17 or 18. Did you have to go through that? Were you interviewed by police like that?
The crime that I've been convicted and sent to prison for happened nearly a year prior to my arrest. So during the time between the crime happening and my arrest, there were several interviews done that I went in willingly to speak to them. Now, I'm going to be completely candid here, Ken. I was already very experienced in talking when it comes to anybody. It's not a lie that I was involved in car theft, so I understood you keep your mouth shut, and if you do cooperate, you only tell them what you want them to know. That's the absolute truth. These kids are different, but when they did put cuffs on me and say you're under arrest for a PC 187, which is murder, and they took me to the police station and they sat me down to speak to me, my words were, I have nothing to say. I want a lawyer. Period. This is one of the reasons why lawyers tell defendants or guys accused of crimes, shut the hell up. Don't say anything. Tell me you want to speak to her. If they reach you your Miranda, say, I understand them. I want a lawyer. Period. Gotcha.
Okay. Thanks. Continue on with what you were talking about. I wanted to know I wanted to talk to somebody that had that experience where maybe they were charged with murder, they're being interrogated, and it's a long interrogation. It's hours on end.
60 seconds remaining.
And what that felt like. But you obviously, you were already experienced, and you were like, I'm not talking.
Yeah, exactly. And I was not intimidated at that point because I knew that they were not my friends. They were there to convict me or get me to say something that I didn't want to say. And look, I knew that I needed a lawyer, so I kept quiet. I did not speak to anybody. These kids obviously did. They thought they could talk their way out.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
Let me call back.
Yep. Bye.
Okay.
Okay. So continue on with go ahead with the interrogation.
Yeah, and this is part of the innocence, why I believe they're innocent. And there were then the inconsistencies in the confessions by not only Miss Kelly, who was supposed to be their crime partner, and we mentioned that. He said rope instead of shoelaces. He said there was a rape. He said it happened during the day when it happened at night. And we know these to be facts. So his confession was inconsistent with the crime scene itself. So, and there's also the fact that the investigators focused on two different individuals, Chris Morgan and Brian Holland. Right after the crimes happened, these guys who had drug histories left for Oceanside, California. And at one point, they were detained by the Oceanside Police Department, and they were polygraphed, and they were spoken to, and a urine and blood sample was retained from them. polygraph, the detective, the expert said that there was inconsistencies in what they were saying, and when asked about the murders, he believed that they're being deceptive. But once they got the urine sample and the blood samples, they basically forgot about it. They left it alone. They didn't look. So they did have those two suspects. So, as I mentioned before, the crime didn't match these kids. And of course, after they were convicted and sent to prison, Eccles received a death penalty. The other one received two 25-year sentences to a life sentence, and the last guy received life without the possibility of parole. But during this time, there's DNA evidence is being basically developed. The technique.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
And there was a lot of attention in this case. I believe a lot of country celebrities, a lot of actors got involved because it looked like these kids may have been innocent. So DNA evidence was produced, and during hearings in the Supreme Court, it was found out that they actually found DNA, and the majority of it was the kids. But there was another DNA, a single DNA, meaning from one other person that didn't match neither of any of the three guys involved or convicted. That's a huge problem for me. When you have a crime scene and you have three people that the prosecution saying these are the guys, and then you find another DNA that's not supposed to be there, I got a problem with that. And so did the the Supreme Court and the courts over there. They were given new trials because of this evidence, and then they entered into what's called an outward plea. Now, in that time, there were movies being made about this case. I don't recall the names of them, but it got a lot of attention. And I believe that's why these guys got out. If they had not received the type of celebrity attention and a cry for, look, really investigate these cases, there's too many inconsistencies, those guys probably would be in prison, and Eccles probably would have been executed if this wouldn't have changed. But the prosecution in the case stuck to their gun and said, look, these are the guys. But they had a problem with that DNA too. So you have two sides of the story here. The DA says it's them. But he also knows he probably can't win the case because once that DNA is introduced into a trial, what jury is going to say, well, we're going to forget about that crucial piece of evidence and we're going to focus on these kids that their DNA is not there? That wouldn't have worked. Well, so they entered into what's called, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so they entered the Alford plea and eventually were released without admitting guilt. But one of the things that bothers me, and I just can't get it out of my head, is that the state wanted to make a big deal about this knife being found behind, I guess, Damien's house in a lake. And I just don't understand that because in my training and my experience and all the research that I've ever done in 20 plus years, if an individual has a knife to commit a crime, they are going to use said knife, especially if they're going to get rid of it. What's the sense of getting rid of it if you never used it? But yet these kids didn't have any stab wounds. And the only thing that they say is significant with a knife is maybe some rake marks with the serrated part of the knife. And that makes absolutely zero sense to me. Can you make sense of that?
Yeah, I can't. I mean, they really made a big deal that one of the children had a mark that was similar to a part of the knife. Like maybe they hit the kid with the blunt part of the knife, and that matched kind of the shape. But that is, again, speculation. There's no science behind, well, it kind of looks like it. I have a huge problem with that. That, again, we're talking about a case where they wanted the defendants to fit the crime, and I don't know how that should have been excluded immediately. And here's another thing. By the way, Vicky, the woman Vicky, whose son Aaron said he saw the murders, she was never charged, by the way, by that theft that she was involved in because she helped out. She later then recanted and said that everything she this case against Eccles and these kids, and they really wanted to get her to be the vehicle for it. That's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah, I just never understood why they made a big deal about that knife, and there was no knife wounds. They were not stabbed. And if that's the case, the offender would have no reason to get rid of said knife. They wouldn't throw it in the lake if they didn't use it.
Yeah, correct. And that's a big problem. The knife was probably there for a very long time. I had to find something that's got a link to the crime. DNA, something has to be there. We just can't speculate, especially when people's lives are at stake. Now, there is another theory, Ken, and you probably know more about this than I do, but there is a guy by the name of Terry Hobbs, and we know him to be the stepfather of one of the children that were murdered. Now, there's a lot of suggestion that he may have been involved in this. There was nothing in the crime scene that suggested occult killing or anything like that. Nothing to do with heavy metal or anything dressed in black. But this guy, Terry Hobbs, had violence in his past. People looked at him. There's actually even a film, I believe, made about a documentary that suggests that he has something to do with it, and it leads to one fiber. One of the blankets or something the kids are wrapped in, one of the hairs found, I believe, matched this guy. There was another also a hair that matched, from what I've read, an African American who it wasn't at a restaurant where he had blood on him. He smeared it on the walls, acting very delusional, maybe even psychotic. The police were called. They got there. One of the officers took a sample of the blood on the walls and then later said, "I lost it."
Yeah, I recall.
That's another big problem for me.
I recall hearing that. The DNA from Terry Hobbs, I believe, was actually a hair from Terry Hobbs that was found in the knot of one of the shoelaces, and I can't remember which boy it was.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
But it didn't exclude Terry Hobbs. It wasn't conclusively linked to Terry, but it was consistent, with Terry Hobbs. And it being located inside the knot, not on the outside, that has significant value to me.
It does to me as well, because that is the only physical evidence that we have that is linked to an individual that was supposedly outside that crime scene. The boys, Eccles and the other two kids, there is zero, and people have gone all this time, zero evidence that physically puts them there. So in my opinion, if I were law enforcement, my attention would focus on, first, excluding Hobbs to see if he's the guy or not. That's where my focus would be, because there's actual physical evidence that ties him to the crime scene. As you mentioned, inside the knot, it's not in a blanket, because that can be explained. He lives in the house with one of the kids rubbed up against him, he has the hair on the jacket, I get that. But inside the knot, that's a little too coincidental for me. And as you know, I don't believe in coincidences.
Yeah, that one, I won't jump on the Terry Hobbs bandwagon like everybody wants to. That's the thing, is everybody wants to point fingers at people because they want to know. They can't stand not knowing who did something. So, they'll point and say, well, Terry Hobbs did it, period. Hey, I'm not there. I will say he should be looked at. I guess he worked at a pig farm or something where they would hog tie the animals, and if that's the case, well, that's another indicator for me that he should be looked at.
I agree. He should be looked at, and I don't like pointing fingers at people that we don't know did it, because that's a horrible thing to be even suggested you did some type of crime like this, because for the rest of your life, people are going to whisper behind your back. You're not going to get rent. You're not going to get a rental home. You're not going to get a job because people are talking about these things. This is a very easy way to ruin someone's life. Is there enough to look at them? Absolutely. And we should investigate it thoroughly. Take as much time as you need to either include him or exclude him.
Right. Now, I won't jump on the bandwagon and say Damien and them are innocent either. I will just say, as I've done in my previous videos that I did about this, is that, hey, I see no direct evidence that Damian Eccles, Jason Baldwin, or Jesse Miskelly were involved. Now, Jesse confessed more than once, from what I understand. I actually read a report from a sheriff's department when they were transporting him where he confessed again. And that bothered me. That it chalks it up to another side that, hey, Damian and them could be guilty. But, yes, you have to figure in his 72 IQ as well. And he's trying to please people and have them, like him and say the things that, they want him to say.
That's absolutely correct. And as you said, we had to take consideration the maturity of a 17-year-old that wants to please. He's trying to help, and he's trying to get himself out of it. Now, we have a similar situation in the yogurt shop murders as well. We had guys that were arrested. They were convicted. Turns out, it may not have been them. The DNA didn't match them. That's another huge indicator that people do confess to things that they've never done. I've never understood that psychology because I would never confess to something that I didn't do. But again, we're talking about a completely different animal when I'm speaking about myself and some of these other kids. I did have a bit of experience. Not that I was, ever convicted of a crime, but I already had, in my opinion, a better sense of who were the good guys and who were the bad guys and who could really screw me around if I opened my mouth. I knew that much, and that may have been my upbringing, the way my father treated me. That kind of gave me a pretty good sense of what to say and what not to say in a situation. But here we are with kids that do talk. So I am not going to say that Eccles and his two partners are innocent, and I can't say that they're guilty. This is a discussion that you and I are having, 30 years after it happened, and there are good reasons and good indicators on both sides, and I hope this is something that the audience understands and kind of gets that, we're basically trying to lend an insight into what happened here. There's arguments for both sides.
Yeah, so
I could argue this case.
Yeah, so for me, when you don't know, okay, let's take a case like this. When you don't know, you have to exclude everything and put your focus on the crime scene. Look at that crime scene and let it tell you, let it dictate where you're going to go. So if I'm there and I'm looking at, okay, 3 boys, hogtied, number 1, that's a big clue like you had stated earlier. That's something that is either a signature.
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Or something that's directly related to this offender. Let's investigate that route and go down that way. And that's how criminal profiling is done. You have to look at the scene and let it talk to you, not the other way around.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I said it earlier, it's the crime scene. It isn't a suspect and then you fit him into that box. No, you have the crime scene tell you what's going on. And I had to call back, but I wanted to ask you about why you felt there was not three, but more than one perpetrator. We touched on it earlier. I'd like to get your opinion on that.
Okay, call me back.
All right. Take care.
Okay, so let me get into why I thought, and still, I'm not going to say a hard fast that there was more than one person, but what led me towards that is the knots that were used on the shoelaces to tie the boys. So, Moore's, he had a 3 and 4 half hitch knot. Stevie had 3 half hitch, and Chris had 2 half hitches. Now, I'm not an expert in knots, but I've had somebody reach out to me that was, and they said, hey, I tie knots all the time. I know what these knots are, and when I tie them, I sometimes tie different type of knots. So you cannot say that based off of the knots that it was more than one person. I get that, but my initial impression was it was more than one because of those knots. I also took in consideration that the boys tied each other up. That would account for 3 different knots. But I certainly can see that maybe it was one person because one person can control 3 boys without a doubt.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. The perp in this case, because he's about domination, he's about control, he wants to see one or more of the victims tie the other kid up. So, yeah, that's consistent. Now, the part that really interests me is, and I may be wrong about this, but I read this. This is several years I read this, but all three of the boys were Cub Scouts. Am I correct in that?
I think you're right on that. At least I know for sure at least one was.
Okay. And that was significant for me because the knots were not simple knots. I mean, they're pretty simple, but they're not the run-of-the-mill knot that everybody ties. If I tie my shoe, it's a particular knot. Everybody that ties a shoe, it's one loop, and then in the second loop, and you have a knot. Those are simple ones. Those are a little bit different than the ones that those kids are tied with, which then brings me back again to one perpetrator who was actually involved in Cub Scouts. Maybe knew the boys from the Cub Scouts. And I mean, I don't know. The first thing I want to know is, and I know this, we couldn't go back in time, but I need to see the crime photos. I need to see, it's a lake area, it's muddy. I want to see the footprints. And if you had a bunch of guys trampling all these things, trying to get to those kids, oh my God, they'd be listening to me scream at them for the next 48 hours of dumb mistakes. But if they didn't do that, and they took photographs of that area, there should be significant amount of footprints if there was more than one guy. If there's one guy, you'd know it by the footprints because of the area. That's number one. Number two, again, I'd want to investigate that particular guy, Hobbs, and what his ties are to the Boy Scouts. Is there any tie at all? Was he a Cub Scout as a boy? I know that killers, because I've had these interviews with them and talked to them, each individual person is different to them. So each individual victim deserves a special treatment. And sometimes they use different weapons on different victims in the same crime scene because it tickles their fancy. It differentiates them from the other ones. Could this guy have tied different knots on the kids because it made them different in his mind to them? Possibly. These are the things that I have questions that always come in, and more than likely, because this case has now piqued my interest again, the next time I go outside, there happens to be a serial killer here who killed boys. And as repulsive as I am, it gets to me when I have to get close to these guys. I'm going to ask them about that specific question. I didn't have a chance to do it this week because he didn't show up yesterday because of the rain. There's a storm out here in the West Coast, and he didn't come out. But I want to ask this guy that question about differentiating or making each victim different by small things like the way he ties them or the weapon he uses on each child.
Well, let me ask you this. You talked about the hog tying, and that certainly could be a sexual fetish. It may not be about control, like controlling them, tying them up. It also could be, I guess, if they were thrown in that water that way, they would drown. So I guess that's an area that I didn't think about. But if it's a sexual fetish, and they're hogtied there, he is going to be sitting on that riverbank or that ditch, whatever it is, and masturbating. Am I wrong?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. Sometimes it isn't about penetration. It's about the sexual fantasy and that getting him going. That is what gets him to the next stage. So you're right.
Right. So, I mean, it might be that the beating is to, I guess that could be a sexual fantasy too. But there doesn't have to be rape in the actual sense of it as somebody just getting off by masturbating by looking at the visual image.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
By just looking at the visual image of those boys tied up.
That's correct. And, we have a famous killer, BTK, did that. He would tie the person up, and as they were strangling themselves by hanging them, he would masturbate as he's watching a child die. He did that in one of his first house invasion type of murders, where he killed the father, the brother, and the mother, as well as the 9-year-old or 8-year-old child in the basement. So you're absolutely correct. Some of these predators do not want to actually sexually penetrate the victim. They want to get off on the visual. And for that type of person to do that, this is a highly evolved predator already. He's already has what gets him off. So again, it lends to the idea that this person was not a couple of teenagers or three teenagers.
Right. Yeah. I had a question in my mind just there, and I lost it all. But you have to take in consideration too the area, the scene itself. BTK, all of his murders were inside a house where you have, you got control. You've staked it out. When people are coming home for the most part. You wait in there. You can almost take your time and do whatever you want. Here, you're out in the open. Yes, you're in the woods, but it's 6 o'clock, 7 o'clock at night. It's not like it's 2 in the morning. There's traffic there. There's people. Does that lead you to believe that maybe it's somebody that they know versus maybe a serial predator?
Well, we know that serial predators sometimes go from town to town. They jump trains or they drive. So sure, it was so close to a highway. Could mean that was just a dumping ground. That he actually did these things to the kids somewhere else in a home. We don't know that. I haven't seen the crime scene. Was there blood in the crime scene? We don't know. And that would, with the mutilation of the genitalia, would suggest there'd be blood in the area. I don't know that for a fact. So yeah, on all accounts, these are questions that would need to be answered.
Yeah, I'll try to answer your one about the blood at the scene. I think from what I saw, some pictures, was that the bank of where the water is, somebody got in that water and splashed water up onto the muddy bank to make it smooth and rinse away all the blood and all the footprints. And which to me, it's hard to say it for sure, but it seems like it would be more of an experienced person and not a juvenile that has never done this before. I don't know. That's just the way it leads me to believe.
Yeah, a lot of questions.
Yeah.
A lot of questions, and that's why experts should be called in these scenes before you get a bunch of guys who really don't know what they're doing. They're trampling, they're looking, they just don't know what they're doing. It takes a real keen eye to see all the things and all the cues and the behavioral traits which would lead to an arrest.
Yeah, I'm never bashing law enforcement for the most part unless they deserve it, but I call it like I see it, and in this case, I just don't see any evidence to arrest somebody. I just don't see it. To me, it's a travesty of justice. Now, I'm not saying they're innocent, but God damn it, you better come up with more evidence, direct physical evidence, before you arrest somebody and put them into the system. It bothers me a lot.
No, it does. Absolutely. Common sense must prevail in all these situations. You can't have somebody going a hot cop, leaking things to the press because they want this guy to fit the crime, and that's a huge problem. And you guys have heard me before. If law enforcement deserves praise, I give them praise. The Idaho investigation, spot on. But this one, and of course, we're in 2023. Advancements in collection of DNA much further along.
Yeah.
But we call it what it is. And in 1993, these guys really did blunder this whole investigation by arresting people that there was no evidence truly to link them aside from rumors.
Yeah, let alone sentence somebody to death. You've taken the most precious thing that we have on this earth and allowing the government to take that away. I don't agree with it, and I don't know. It all starts with the crime scene and the arrest. Once the arrest is taken, they're in the system, and then all that other stuff can lead all the way to your death. So it starts with you, the police officer, the investigator, at the scene to make the correct determinations so somebody's life does not get ruined or ended.
No, I couldn't agree with you more on that. This isn't just me agreeing with you. This is common sense stuff. This is the stuff that most people, at least the people that have common sense, would say, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do. Unfortunately, emotions get involved, pressure, politics, all that crap that should never go into an investigation plays a part in this. And we have this situation where 30 years later, guys like you and I are still debating and talking about what they did right, what they did wrong. Are these guys innocent? Are they guilty?
Right, and you brought up the big one there, and that's politics. And they have no business in investigations at all. So you're absolutely correct there. All right, you got anything else to add on West Memphis 3? I mean, we could probably talk for a day on this easily, but we only allotted 60 minutes.
Yeah, that's about it right there. I mean, we have pretty much everything.
This call and your telephone number will be monitored and recorded.
You and I spoke a little bit about what's possibly coming up for the next episode, and we'll probably make the determination, but we talked about possibly the yard situation on death row and behavioral cues, traits on when something's going to happen in the yard, how coffee plays a big part in how I analyze a yard, and how I am intimate with everybody's habits on the row. What I mean by that is that I have intimate knowledge on how they supposed to respond every morning, what they do, what their habits are, and when they don't do what they're supposed to be doing, which is their habits, why an antenna goes up in the back of my head and I start watching for different behavioral cues. This all plays a part in how I read people, read situations, and how I become to be known as a guy who, well, gets in the brain of serial killers, because these are the things I look for, and we're going to discuss that next time pretty in detail.
Yeah, so everybody that's on death row there's 700 and something inmates on death row, am I correct, in San Quentin?
Correct.
They're there because they murdered somebody, right? There's nobody on death row for something else. Or is there?
You have to kill somebody with a special circumstance to be here on death row, yes.
A special circumstance. That's interesting. So it's not just that it's, let's say, somebody that killed their wife and 3 kids. They don't automatically go to death row.
Well, they would, because that's the special circumstance of multiple murder. To kill one person, very difficult, but there needs to be a felony. Well, the murder is in the commission of a felony. Murder robbery, murder burglary, murder rape, multiple murder, murder kidnap. All these add a special...
You have 60 seconds remaining.
Which then makes you eligible for the death penalty.
Oh, I see. Okay. See, learn something new every day. I appreciate it.
Well, there you have it. A very interesting look from Bill in regards to the West Memphis 3 case. Before we started this video, remember I said it's everything's a teachable moment. Maybe there's something in there that you hadn't thought of. And in this case, there was. I can't say that I haven't thought of, but he explained it where I could think about it more. And that is 2 things. One, the hog tying of the victims. I've always been under the... I guess assumption, it's just been my theory, that the individual or individuals that did this did it to control. And I still hold on to that theory. Now you can see me and Bill disagreed about a couple of things, but one of the things he seemed to be leaning towards was one offender, and I'm not so sure about that. It certainly could be. But another thing is the hog tying. Now, it's a very important aspect of this case. I think it's a huge clue. And obviously the knots. So he tends to believe, from what I gather, or what he said, is that the hog tying was done for sexual gratification. That is hard for me to wrap my head around because of the location, because of it being outside. And I know it has happened before in the past, but I mean, I could get it. I could get behind that if it was, boy, to me it would have to be a very experienced sexual offender, a pedophile, to get gratification from hog tying and 3 boys up. And as Bill said, getting images in his head, everyone being different. And that's why the knots are different. That's a little bit of a leap for me. I won't go there. He's certainly entitled to his opinion, and I respect his opinion. But for me, I still think the hog tying right now is part of a control and not a gratification, although it certainly is the first time that made me think of that and the possibility of that. And I don't know if I've ever heard that before. You know, I'm sure somebody out there had that opinion and theory, but I just don't remember hearing it before. So it was very good to hear that from Bill, you know, and maybe there's some validity to that. But again, the hog tying is very important in this case, I believe. So there we go. Death Row Convict, Bill Noguera. Remember, he says he's not an inmate. He's a convict, and there's a difference. I always thought the annotation of a convict had more of a derogatory meaning. And maybe it does, but Bill makes no bones about it. He's a convict. So maybe I should start saying death row convict instead of death row inmate. But regardless, that's his opinion, his theory on the West Memphis 3 case. You know, there's some valid theories, valid opinions that he brought out. So, I mean, take it for what it's worth. And hopefully, you know, the whole goal is to help somebody. So hopefully somebody in charge will see that or whatever and say, oh, we didn't think about this, or this guy fits that mold. And maybe there is a, you know, a pedophile in that area that used hog ties and got gratification off of seeing that. That little detail could be something huge. You never know. So that's why we do these shows. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed it. So till the next time, hey, thanks for watching. Mains out.